Yeah, in fact, it's interesting. Twice in the car today, the rate in national news has been on the opiate problem. Both your paper today has got an article about an OD. Seattle Times, New York Times, this is every place. My first suggestion for step number one is to actually figure out how huge this is, and it is huge. If I've talked with Paul Pastor, the Pierce County Sheriff, with the Gig Harbor Chief of Police, for example, they simply have no resources. They are not policing drugs in Pierce County. You know, if there's a big drug bust or something like that. But you remember the days of the meth task force when Kitsap County and Pierce County, we were really trying to root out meth. Now those products are all coming in, they're imported. And we do not understand just how huge this is and how far down into our youth population it's going. And what you see is this new, I'm not even sure the names, fentanyl is the new synthetic drug. And then in the New York Times today is a piece about this elephant drug called something fentanyl, canafentanyl. Just incredibly powerful things. So you've got places now where police forces, when they run across a drug person or first responders, run across a drug person with an OD problem, and they're carrying these kits to try naloxone, something like that, where you can get an OD'd person back to life. They're afraid to even touch those people because a tiny speck of these new synthetic drugs could kill the first responder. So we've got a very serious problem. And clearly what you need is to fund police in public health. And what I would do, obviously, is immediately lift the 1% cap on city funding and channel the maximum amount of marijuana money into this. That was, as you remember, in the marijuana proposal was the idea that most of that money would go to prevention. But the fact is, you remember when we used to have these really effective and ugly campaign ads and billboards to prevent kids from smoking? All that's gone away. All that money was taken away by the legislature. So we're going to have to not only fuel with funding the police forces, the public health people, we're going to have to do a massive prevention campaign that we haven't been doing. A couple of other things on my list are to radically increase the number of school nurses, school counselors. The place where I would start attacking this, always start with the kids in your schools. One, because they're going to grow up with this. You need to, if you're going to do prevention, you're going to have to do it starting in the schools. And we've got a serious school problem. And secondly, you need to somehow, I've got question marks for in my bullet point on this, we need to figure out a way to cross-connect the schools, the school authorities, school nurses, with the cops, with the public health people, so that they're sharing information. Remember when we passed a bill, anti-meth bill, that required the pharmacies to share the information about who was cashing in prescriptions. And we had an immediate radical effect of depressing the use of those over-the-counter or prescribed pills as the source of the chemicals you needed to do meth at home.
Go back to the word, you said massive prevention campaign.
Right. Tell
me what that exactly means, because you're talking about law enforcement, you're talking about schools, and I imagine that's kind of an intervention, but what does that look like?
Well,
what does prevention look like?
So prevention means all of the above. It means that you are going
What's the most important thing to spend money on? Maybe that's what I want to know.
The single most important to spend money on is your police and public health people and the counseling folks in the schools. It's not hugely expensive, but very expensive, effective to spend money on billboards, things like that, that keep the kids from smoking. You know, this whole vaping thing, by the way, which I'm really opposed to. Vaping is not a healthy thing for our society. I voted against it. I still will.
You drive down the street, it looks like the car's on.
I know. You see, used to think it was the window washer. Now it's the vaping kid inside. So that would be you've got to fund police, you've got to fund public health, you've got to fund the schools, you've got to do prevention, and you've got to spread drug courts. One thing you do not do is dial up the arrests, right? We should not make the mistake we made in the 90s and the 2000s of thinking that we could arrest our way out of the drug crisis.
What about the dealers? Would you enforce more?
Sure, and these dealers are major, as far as I understand, major international Chinese and Mexican cartels that are moving these chemicals into the country.
What is the law enforcement role then? Prevention? It's not arresting, but we've got to be tough on this too. What could law enforcement be doing differently with that money you say we need to get to?
Well, first of all, you've got to have people like the police chief in Gig Harbor and the sheriff in Pierce County saying, I've got enough resources that I've actually got officers out on the street. Those cops see where the dealing done it. They see the deals going on. Mere presence where you've got the cops, the schools, public health people all working together. We know how to do this. This is not
Do you think they should be, you expressed some fear because of the unknown with the overdose drug that would be administered. Do you like the first responders are carrying that? Is that appropriate?
No, it is.
Should it be in the schools?
Of course, no, it's appropriate. I used to do chemical and biological warfare for the Defense Department. All right, so I understand the business about antidotes. What's important is that these new chemicals are so deadly, according to the paper, that even a tiny flake exposed could kill a police officer or a firefighter. So they've got to be extremely careful out there on the streets now.
You supportive of that naloxone being in schools? Should they have the ability to administer? Is that?
I would say yes, absolutely. And so you need nurses, school counselors who are trained to understand what's going on. I do not, and my starting point is, I don't think we really appreciate just how big this problem is, how rapidly it's come, how cheap heroin is, and how these new chemicals, these new synthetics, have taken us way beyond heroin. I mean, it's hard for us normal people to think that we've got a heroin epidemic here, but we do.
Yeah. What's your thought?
So let me take this as two parts. One, the coordination, but start, David, with the idea of the homeless, the housing first. Clearly, everyone you talk to in the housing response business, whether it's Larry Ayers here at Kitsap Human Resources, Seattle folks, they all say you've got to help with housing, which is expensive. So I think that's right. It was interesting, when you research the Utah system, you can find people like AEI, the American Enterprise Institute think tank back in DC, used to be around the corner from the think tank where I worked, says that it really isn't quite as good in Utah as they're saying. But this idea that you're going to cooperate, delivering housing services is important. There are a lot of different ways to do that. Nobody seems to have the magic. If you just did this, then you would suddenly have everybody housed. But it does seem important that whatever you do, including with people, many of these people are codependent, they're homeless, they've got emotional or chemical dependency problems, a very complex series of problems, but that seems to be the right thing to do. Now, the other half of your question was about this cooperation. Give you an example. Joe Rozak, who's the Kitsap mental health guy, and I went down to see DSHS head about 3 heads ago with this idea that Joe had hatched, that if we could only let the state's money flow directly down to the local level, the local agencies were quite capable of coordinating the delivery of mental health, emotional health services. We didn't make a lot of progress with that, but I thought it was the right idea. In general, in my view, that's the right thing to be doing at this point in our history. We've had, like the feds, where I used to work, the state, starting in the 90s, started to bulk up state agencies. So you get these very large state agencies that are trying to deliver services directly. I think we need to change that philosophy, start downsizing the state agencies and using them to feed funds and guidance to groups of locals. Now, right here in Tacoma, I'm not sure exactly how healthy it is right now, but there has been every week a group of about, as I recall when I sat in with them, about 16 different agencies around town that were church groups, local community agencies, all the way up to Larry Ayers, Kitsap Community Resource, Rosax folks, all talking about this week, these are the problems we've got, what resources do we have, who's going to take care of these particular cases. So the secret, I think, of good government is that it is as local as possible, and we need to shift in these areas to being local.
Kitsap County passed that 1/10 tax to
which wasn't enough. It was a good thing to do. Pierce County, we don't have it. But even with the 1/10%, Joe Rozek will tell you that the state underfunded the basic budget.
There was a story in the paper this morning about needing that grant, and that's kind
Correct.
of now they
Right.
can build a building. Do you agree?
So it's very nice the feds partly solved the problem. Yeah, go ahead, I want to take you over to the schools again.
Okay, I was just going to say, in general, do you support that kind of a county-led, them applying
Absolutely.
tax rather than it coming?
Absolutely, it's the right thing. We should be, as a philosophy of government, be downsizing state agencies and trying to.
And then what's the state role?
The state role is funding and technical guidance. This is the legal, the best practices framework, but you should be letting local people do that. You can do that in the environment, as we get a chance to talk about.
And you need to sell that to the federal government too.
Well, Mr.
Strings
Reagan had
attached.
the block grant idea.
They have the one block grant, but the other money's coming through Medicaid.
But understand that the federal government, my career was when I wasn't at sea, I was in the world's biggest bureaucracy, the Pentagon, thinking that, we feds really were the guys in charge of the world. That's not so. Almost all of the really yeasty problems of education, the environment, employment are local problems that should be handled by the states, counties, and cities, and local agencies. All the action in government, almost all of it, is at the state and local level these days. I want to get you back to thinking about these mental health and these coordination problems at the school level. We have, every school counselor that I talk to gives you the same answer when you say, how's your caseload? And the answer is through the roof, unquote. Our schools are really in trouble for emotional health, whether it's the extreme of suicide, and I know that you've got a background in this area, the suicide prevention problems, general emotional health, this toxic testing climate that we've imposed on our schools, including on the teachers. We are not running healthy school climates in general. We are radically underfunded in school counselors and school nurses. We really need to be beefing up.
How is that?
I think it's organic to basic education, David. So tomorrow, the state, to my astonishment, the state has filed a brief that they're going to argue tomorrow before the Supreme Court, saying that we're almost there. We have just about met all of the McCleary goals. They didn't say anything about emotional health, about low-income kids being, being supported in schools the way they need to. They said nothing about the teacher crisis. That's one of the reasons that I'm running, and one of the reasons I filed as an independent Democrat, because I'm as upset with my own Democrat leaders for joining that lawsuit in trying to convince the court that we're actually okay.
So the other issues that you just brought up, you think are also part of the definition of basic education?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's perfectly clear. Read the definition. It is settled law what basic, what ample means, what general and uniform means, what regular and reliable means, what all means. All those criteria that frame the McCleary decision are settled law and not being challenged,
Should the,
including building the buildings that the kids go to school in.
the estimates for what's still needed on the shortfall, anywhere from 3 billion to 8 billion?
My number's higher, the plaintiffs.
That's what I was gonna ask you.
Yeah, I've been.
When you start putting all this stuff, it's gotta go up.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Now, the plaintiffs, in their brief that they filed, that they'll argue tomorrow, say just on the staff side, it's 5.9 billion, a biennium for staff. Doesn't include building the buildings. So the state is in there saying, well, it's
That's
one.
staff without the counselors, things you're talking
Exactly.
about. Exactly. Okay.
Yes, but if you look at the definitions, again, if you're a low-income kid, you have a constant, this is a positive right. You know, the right written into Article 9, Section 1 is a positive right of every citizen, every kid in the state.
Well,
This fund education first, or the mythical fourth budget, is stake law. Okay, this is a cover story designed to be able to walk away from the McCleary obligations completely. It doesn't make any sense. The basic underlying argument is there's plenty of money. If those Democrats who run the place would just take it out of the drawer and put it on education, everything would be fine. But we were just talking about the youth health, youth drug problems, all of these other things. All of those have to be balanced out. So I'm strongly opposed to this, and have been for years, to this fund education first, or the current slogan, the fourth budget. Now what I have done is create a different way of budgeting, by the way, that I'll leave you a copy with. We need to rethink that we do and need to indeed need to change the way we do budgets. Jim. And I'd be glad to come back and talk to you more about this if you like. The total cost of McCleary is much larger than the state is acknowledging when they go to court tomorrow. And then you also, do you want to shift over a minute and talk about how you get the money?
that's exactly where we're going to go, yeah.
So where's the money come from?
But wait, I never heard, well, how much do you think it is? It's more than the 5.9, I guess.
Yeah, I think on a biennial basis, it's around 8 to 11 billion more.
Well, how do you, 8 to 11,
Something.
so there's 3 billion in the middle here, and you're not accounting for billions of dollars. Where do you get these numbers?
What you do is you sit down, and in this, my Appalachian agenda, as you recall, I spent about a year and a half getting ready to run for superintendent of public instruction. So I was so appalled that the state, the legislature of both parties colluding, was saying we're just about there, it's just money. Tried to unravel what is it that we actually need to do McCleary. So if you add up, what does it need for teacher funding, teacher training? What do you need to do for money to put into your low-income school kids? What do you need to do if you're going to buy the buildings? And if you're going to fully equip those buildings, then your numbers start climbing up into that area. Okay. So you do comprehensive tax reform. Where it does not come from, in my view, I've been opposed, I've said at this table several times, I'm opposed to the income tax. That's my far left Democrat friends would still harbor the...
Everybody that sat here is opposed to that.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, some of them down the
We're
road.
all Kitsap.
They're all Kitsap folks.
Yeah.
So where that money comes from is from fundamental tax reform, from on all three kinds. If you make your sales tax less regressive, and the Senate Republicans joined the Senate Democrats in carrying a table around the state last year, that showed $1 billion or more additional revenue from reforming sales tax. Reuben Carlisle has offered.
How does it become less
sales tax mean?
But, well, first of all, you've got a sales tax system that is very narrow in that you've got 694 tax exemptions. So although it looks like it's a uniform sales tax, it's actually got all these exemptions that make it, as you guys put in your question, exceedingly regressive.
Okay, so take those exemptions out, and that's the reforming of the sales tax part of it.
And you have to move up, you've got to move your sales tax, if you call them exemptions or just things that aren't taxed right now. You've got to move up into the level of where our higher end economy is working.
So you're saying increase sales tax?
I think he's saying just tax more
I'm
things.
trying to understand.
You've got to tax more things.
Are you saying there are high-end items that low-income people do not purchase and are not being taxed?
Correct.
Is that, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Luxury tax, is that what you're talking about?
Pardon?
You talk about like a luxury tax. Boats, airplanes.
Look, this is not trying to get around the edges. If you're going to talk about serious tax reform, the last thing you do is pick a target and said, I'm going to get rid of that tax right there. And then I will take that tax and do it. What you need to do is start with, what is it that I'm trying to buy? How much does that cost? So that the taxpayer says, if I spend this money, I'm going to get that product, right? So most of our conversations about taxes are just saying, well, I don't want to pay. Nobody wants to pay more taxes. You've got teachers who would like teacher income to go up, who will say, I don't want to increase my taxes, right? But so where you start in fundamental tax reform is with what is it that you're trying to buy? How much does that cost? Now, I think here are a couple of original contributions for you. Before you're going to do we haven't talked yet about property tax and the levy swipe silliness. Before you're going to do any kind of fundamental tax reform, you're going to have the public buy-in to this. And if it's going to be a property tax reform, which we clearly need, it's going to have to be something that has a local sense of ownership in it. The idea that you're going to have a single statewide property tax is constitutional in that it's uniform, but I don't think it's politically practical. WEA is trying to fight the McCleary stuff. Thank God I don't have a WEA endorsement. The WEA is trying to keep the property tax back at the local district level so they can, quote, bargain for it. I don't believe that's true. What we need to do, because of the different cost of living, if this property tax is going to be raised and made uniform around the state, as it has to do, is going to have some kind of sense that in our part of the state, with our cost of living, this is our fair tax. And the voters are going to, nobody's written that mechanism yet. I think one of the ways you could do that is with a variation of the every decennial redistricting panel. Some mechanism that every 10 years you reset what those statewide rates are. Now you're going to have another mechanism. If you are going to raise your taxes, if you're going to have this comprehensive tax reform that generates just for education alone, we haven't talked about the cost of mental health or employee pay, the other things, need to generate a lot of money. You're not going to be able to get taxpayer approval for that unless there is, particularly around the schools, some sense of efficiency and effectiveness. So I'm proposing something like an inspector general that we use at the federal level. I've talked with both candidates in the SBI race about doing something like this. I've talked with Brian Sontag, who generally agrees with this. Whether it's inside the state auditor or an independent agency, we're going to have some mechanism that credibly shows the taxpayers that the money, the new larger amounts of money going to school, is actually being well spent.
Let me ask you a question with that. we had another candidate in here, different race, not your race, it was not your opponent. We talked about the same exact issue, and what the candidate was expressing was that the legislature feels like it can't account for how money is being spent, and there was frustration at that. Do you feel the same way?
No.
Because there's very complicated decisions that get made at the local level, correct?
Correct.
So what is the Inspector General, how deeply should that person be looking?
Well,
that's what you're proposing.
Deep enough, you know, I'm familiar with inspectors general, so inspectors general look right down all the way to the microscopic.
Is that fair to do to a principal?
Absolutely. They're in public money,
Okay.
of course. Now, what we do, here's the problem. The state auditor audits with a green eye sheet. He's checking, did the numbers add up according to the rules? Nobody is looking, is this effective? Is there a different way to do business? So the way to test this is to say, does the local taxpayer saying, you know, I see this report, yeah, I'm satisfied that my money is being well spent.
What would that look like? What would you show me? If you're going to ask me for that tax, what do you think this person would show me to prove effectiveness?
Well, a couple of specific examples. I would say, for example, that the staff, the standard thing that the opponents, people who are trying to make sure we don't fund McCleary, are saying we're not getting money to the classroom, right? Mm-hmm. So what you would be able to say is, look, the research shows that this amount of money in the teacher's hands, this amount of money in the counselors, these other things all add up to an effective education system. And that's the kind of thing that an IG, I think, could do that an auditor can't.
So is the other side, not necessarily your opponent, but people that don't agree with you on this funding level, are they saying that these things are not really part of basic education?
Correct. And in fact, Martha, that's exactly what the state will argue tomorrow.
So they don't think that perhaps, for example, that there's extra needs that low-income students have, and so that's not part of the basic education?
It's not in the state's brief, as I've read it a couple of times. They're trying to limit it down just to K3 class size, MSOC. You know, they've got 4 narrow items, and they're saying as long as we've spent that money, we're good to go.
And then the rest of any of those needs must be met at the local level?
Correct. And the McCleary decision says that's not right. McCleary decision says the local people should not spend their own money unless they just want to have something that's an enhancement, a local enhancement. So a levy swap is sharing poverty. What it says, we know that the whole system is underfunded, and at that underfunded level right now, we are moving some money from some districts to other districts. If you say that the whole system is fully funded, there is no longer a levy swap. You've got uniform tax rates, maybe adjusted for regional variations. Now here, just think of this example. In Peninsula School District, where I live, in Gig Harbor, the taxing rate is $2.33, according to $2.33 per thousand. In Seattle, it's $1.34, something like that, about $1 less. If you go down to White Salmon in the Columbia River in the Gorge, it's $4.30. Because, even though it's a small district, they have very low property tax bases, so you can own exactly the same house in White Salmon and pay about 3 times the taxes that a person in Seattle pays. Is that fair? Is that regressive? Yes.
So what's the reform that would
So the reform would be that we uniformly tax property. Why should a person, if we uniformly tax gas, we uniformly tax candy bars, why are we not uniformly taxing property? And I would say, I can see...
Uniformly tax it, but keep the money directed towards the local district. more so than up into a state pool and spread out.
No, what you need is I would not, my variation is on the front end, on the supply side. If there is a reason in this area why the schools are less expensive to run, then the tax rate would be a little lower here in the northeast corner of the state, say, than it is in, in Seattle.
Could you make the case that in a rural area where home values have a lower value, that if somebody's paying $4 on a $100,000 house, and somebody's paying $1 on a $1 million house, they actually, I mean, it's not as cut and dried as you claim.
Now, pound of flour, a pound of feathers weighs the same as a pound of lead. Okay.
Exactly. They're not paying 4 times as much. You said that
they are.
White salmon are paying 4 times as much, and I would maintain that because the house values are different.
No, $100,000 house in white salmon
is he was saying the rich house in white salmon, because all the rest of them surrounding are so poor. So they can get it apart.
Right.
But what?
So
this is the efficiency, possibly inspecting, so you could put this in front of voters.
Correct.
Is not realistic in the coming session, because this is a complicated thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing at all, but there's a gap between
so
there.
It's very important that you raise this, because no one is, including your sister organization, the Seattle Times, everybody thinks that if they simply pound the legislature harder, they make him write paramount duty 1,000 times, that somehow they will do this. The fact, there's 2 things that do not exist, to finish McCleary. One is there's nothing to vote on. Nobody knows what that total is. We haven't agreed on that total, and the state's submission to the court tomorrow is radically below what common sense says it is, right? We have none, we don't know how much the teacher crisis costs. We have not actually added up the cost of having all of our low-income and minority kids graduate at the same rate as the upper-class white kids graduate. They've got a constitutional right to have that opportunity. That's more expensive. There's no machinery that has done that. So there isn't anything for the legislature to vote on next year. They don't know what the bill is, and they don't know what goals they've got.
You're just trying to stop the fines from happening right now.
No, I'm not. I think the fines are just fine.
That's what your job would be.
Now, what are you going to have to do? A good example to me is to give yourself kind of a mental model for this is the gay marriage. Regardless of whether you like the gay marriage process or not, over several years, the strategists behind the gay marriage movement took step by step of moving the state through a series of bills and public referenda to gradually winch the state just about as fast as it could politically go until they reached marriage equality. That's what we're going to have to do in McCleary. There is no one vote that finishes this. Whether or not the court accepts that, I don't know whether, I've had the pleasure of listening to Barbara Madsen, the chief out on the campaign stuff. She's very articulate about how they thought this through. They're not going to persuade her that somehow with that brief that they're in good shape. But I do believe that she and the court, if you show them that you've got a rational process, now what do you need to do that? We've got to reach and this is back to my candidacy, one important point for you. If you look at next year's session, you've not only got to do McCleary, you've got to, in a very complicated way, you've got to do mental health, you have to pick your problems, several other problems, and you've got a legislature that no matter how this election comes out, will have very weak control in the House, I think with Democrats, very weak control with Democrats, Republicans in the Senate, a weak governor, okay? There is no power, there's not enough party muscle in Olympia. There won't be to simply power your way through. So if we're going to solve these problems, it's because a new set of centrists from both sides of the aisle decide it's time to get on with governing the state.
What about that
So what would make you?
That committee, Martha, is a sham. It was deliberately created to prevent action. And in fact, the bill was written so that when the committee, the Joint Task Force Committee, reports, it is unable to fully answer the original question.
Why do you think you would be one of those centrists, and what would you start?
Oh, because I've got a long record. That's why I'm running, because that's who I am.
What do those centrists need to make the first step then?
What?
You use the gay marriage analogy, and I understand
Which analogy?
the gay marriage analogy. You
Yeah.
use that to say suddenly it got momentum.
You need a strategy group.
What's the strategy?
What I'm preparing to do, if I'm able to win this election, is to immediately try to assemble a group of legislators and other people who are able to think through how would we proceed. The legislature right now is not capable of doing that original creative thought. Somebody needs to lead the horse to water. We need some strategic thinking going on here that hasn't happened. The two parties have been locked in a battle for control. It's been a political warfare for several cycles. So
let me ask you another question.
Okay.
And again, I'm going to just follow you on
Sure.
this analogy you're trying to use. The voters also did a thumbs up through an initiative. Do you have a question you think we should ask the people of this state on this issue?
I don't know which specific questions, but clearly that property tax change is going to be one of them. We're going to have to map out over several years the legislation and the public referendum. One of the striking things right now is that the public has not been consulted on these things.
What would you want to ask them? What do you think the public should be asked? Because that would influence how people vote. It influences the income tax question that we keep coming up with, doesn't it?
Yeah,
you guys don't touch it because
income tax to
why should we ask them this time?
See, income tax to me is a dead end.
It's dead because people voted no.
No, it's dead because it is so complicated that if you go do that, if you decide your contribution in life is going to be an income tax in Washington State, God bless you, you've got another 10 years of hard work to do. What happens to all the rest of it? What happens to the kids, the mental health? We don't have time for that. Maybe that's, if we're going to get there, that's sometime in the future. We need to solve these urgent problems right now. Our school system is in trouble. Our state's middle class is disappearing. We've got drug problems. We should be thinking about how to solve those things, not figuring out how we're going to create some new kind of tax.
Go back.
Minimum wage.
I'm in favor of increasing the minimum wage to this new level. In the past, I've sat at this table and been opposed to the $15 and the measles approach. But my analysis now of the general state of the economy, if you look at our Washington State citizens, the median income over the last 15 years is down by 7%. So my main engine of moving us up is with education. I genuinely believe that what we need to invest in is education. We've got the jobs, we just are not producing the people. But I do believe that we should be putting some gradually rising floors under there.
And
you know, $13 minimum wage is only $26,000. You know, you're not going to keep a family of 3 or 4 healthy on $26K.
No. On education, that includes vocational training? Or?
Most definitely. Okay. Not every, and I have been, as you know, the chair of the Higher Education Committee. But the major place where we need to build out, and that's one of the problems with talking exclusively about McCleary, we need to build out our community and technical college system by doing a couple things. I'm working with people right now, including some union leaders, on running start for the trades, so that all the way down into middle school, kids would not just be on an academic track. They would, if they be on any track, here at South Kitsap High School, for example, the vocational education, CTE kids, career tech ed kids, were actually getting higher grades and graduating at greater numbers than the so-called academic kids. And we need to build out our community college and apprentice career tech ed system so that we can take working adults who are caught in the old economy and let them get into this new economy. We've got the jobs, we just don't have the people. Well, because the Constitution is very clear in more than one place about who controls the common schools. The measure, as you know, the court's already written about this. The measure was written in a defective way. So my view is that we've got plenty of creativity available in our public schools. So I'm a true believer about climate change, but I'm going to vote against that measure, the carbon measure, and I'm disappointed in the other things that we've done. My specific, I've been working on ocean acidification because our carbon absorption into the Sound and the Pacific is growing rapidly. You remember that I wintered over in the Arctic for a year, wintered over in the South Pole for 14 months. I've been to the South Pole. The ice I used to live on, both in the North and South, is not there anymore. I've got a degree in meteorology and general science. So I'm beyond alarmed. What we can be doing here, the two things in the campaign that I've been proposing, one is a simple thing called aquifer management. Here in Kitsap County, Kitsap PUD, as you know, does a wonderful job of aquifer management. From a historical accident set of responsibilities, I would like to see that aquifer management practiced here, practiced all over the state. Now the other thing, in our district here, the 26, which has got Boku shoreline and lots of shellfish aquaculture, we have been involved in this battle about too much aquaculture, too much shellfish, or not enough. And my view is what we need to do now is to build, and we've got the technology, we've got the research, the science, and the computers to do this, is to actually show ourselves a synoptic view of our complex climate. That we could show all these webs of relationships of where the seabirds, where the fish were going, so that we could actually see this climate in real time and how it's changing. That would let you, back to another point you were making here, would let you manage our climate mitigation and recovery efforts through local efforts, not through this failed Puget Sound partnership. The Puget Sound partnership to me is, I mean, it's had 3 strikes. It's been at the plate over and over. It hasn't worked. It's time to get rid of that agency and rely upon your local.
So, Larry, I just wanted to get back a little bit, make sure I understand. So you're going to, this bipartisan effort, you're saying. Right. So who would you want to work with? Give me some, I mean, like, you're saying this joint committee was a sham. I'm just trying to get a sense of who do you work with? How do you do that? How are you going to?
Look, I could walk you around the state. Let's start in Yakima with Senator Curtis King, who's the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. You'd be astonished at, in the Republican conservative climate over there in Yakima, he's got a very interesting background and sensitivity. Several of the House members from the Yakima Valley that I've worked with on the Appropriations Committee, we may have different kind of political philosophy approaches, but those are constructive and creative. You know, it's not that my party has to be right, it's that we both take those sets of views and work together. So I think there are a lot of people around. You know, I'm not here to debate my opponent, but my opponent has said in public that he's one of the most conservative. He's a member of the Red Seven, as he proudly told Kitsap Tea Party. The 7 guys who vote no on everything, the most conservative voters in the House. So but there are, and we've got them over on the Democrat far left side. You know, we've got ideologues, but there is a broad middle out there. And by the way, our Constitution, the structure of our legislature, and the rules that our legislature follow actually foster bipartisanship. About 85% of all the bills voted out of the House, in my experience, actually have strong majorities because of the rules we have about cutoffs. If a bill is not ready to go, it dies. Something the U.S. Congress, a discipline the U.S. Congress doesn't have. So we've got a number of things that actually foster bipartisanship. And I have run for 4 years the Higher Ed Committee on a determinedly bipartisan basis, and it works. There's plenty of room for Democrats and Republicans to speak their piece, but at the end, they can figure out ways in which they decide what to do together, and then everybody agrees with it. Okay. So the one way to ask this question is, what's the single most important piece of work ahead? And you'll get people say, well, it's McCleary or it's mental health or something. The most important piece of work, looking at all those things which have to be done together, is the legislature's ability to do something. So my view is that the single biggest question facing the legislature is, are you going to be able to be represented by people who go to Olympia to do something? And I'd be perfectly willing to be judged by the voters about whether or not I'm a person who's determined to go down there and move the place. And that's one of the reasons I filed as an independent Democrat. Because as you've heard, I'm upset with my own leadership. The whole legislature has been inert. If we had an EKG on the legislature, it would be flatlined. You've got members coming back and talking about all the bills they passed and all the excitement they had. Nothing happened. They walked away from all of their responsibilities. We need people who are going to down there, and as I said, you're not going to have enough political power on one side simply to muscle the other side out of the road. If we're going to solve these serious problems that we have to solve, it's going to happen because a group of centrists work together.
Thank you.